realized my husband was finally gone when they handed me the microphone. Not when I saw the casket, not when the choir sang his favorite hymn, not even when I watched people I barely recognized cry harder than I could. It was when the funeral director nodded at me, gentle, rehearsed, and whispered, "Whenever you're ready." Ready. The word felt cruel. I stood slowly, my legs heavy, my hands numb. The church was packed. Front pews filled with family, co-workers, church members, people who spoke his name with reverence, who called him a good man, a faithful husband, a pillar. I heard whispers float through the sanctuary like incense. He adored her. Such a strong marriage. You could tell he was devoted. I nodded politely as I walked past them, the practiced widow smile fixed on my face, the same smile I'd learned to wear years ago, back when the truth first cracked open and I realized the man sleeping beside me was also living a life I didn't recognize. I hadn't planned this. My notes were folded neatly in my purse, safe words, gentle words, words that would protect his legacy the way I'd protected it for years. I had rehearsed them in the mirror, in the car, in the hospital hallway while machines beeped and his breathing slowed. But when I reached the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, something shifted. I saw her. Not in the front row, she wouldn't dare sit there. She was halfway back, dressed in black like everyone else, head bowed just enough to look respectful. The woman who'd once called my phone by mistake. The woman who'd known my husband as someone entirely different. Our eyes met. And in that moment, the careful script I'd written dissolved. I gripped the sides of the podium and inhaled slowly, aware of how quiet the room had become. The air felt thick, expectant. They were waiting for me to confirm the story they already believed. "My husband," I began, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest, "was many things." Nods rippled through the crowd. A generous man, a hard worker, someone people admired. More nods. I paused. And he was also deeply flawed. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. People straightened, heads tilted, someone cleared their throat. I hadn't meant to say that part out loud, but once the truth found air, it didn't want to go back into hiding. For years, I continued, choosing each word carefully, I carried parts of him that no one else ever saw. I protected him. I made excuses. I told myself love meant silence. My hands stopped shaking. "I'm not here to tear him down," I said. "I'm here to say goodbye honestly, because pretending almost broke me." The sanctuary was completely still now. No whispers, no shifting, no coughs, just listening. And as I stood there, heart open and unguarded for the first time in a very long time, I understood something with crystal clarity. This wasn't about exposing him. It was about freeing myself. And once the truth steps into the light, it doesn't ask permission to stay hidden. It only asks how much more you're willing to carry alone. The silence after my last sentence was so complete it felt physical. It pressed against my ears, my chest, my throat. I could hear the hum of the lights overhead, the faint creak of wooden pews as someone shifted uncomfortably. No one expected this. They had come prepared for praise, for memory polishing, for the neat wrapping of a life into something easier to carry home. I hadn't planned to disrupt that. but the truth has its own momentum. I glanced down at my notes, still folded in my purse, untouched. The words I'd prepared were suddenly useless, thin and dishonest compared to what was rising up now. My heart hammered, but my voice stayed steady, almost detached, like I was finally allowed to tell a story that had lived too long inside me. I loved my husband, I said. I loved him fiercely. And because of that love, I learned how easy it is to disappear while standing right next to someone. A murmur moved through the room, barely audible, like wind brushing tall grass. I felt eyes on me, curious, confused, unsettled. There were years, I continued, when I questioned my own instincts, when I told myself I was imagining things, when I believed loyalty meant absorbing pain quietly so other people could remain comfortable. My throat tightened, but I didn't stop. I became very good at protecting an image, very good at smiling in public and breaking in private. I didn't look at the woman again. I didn't need to. I could feel her presence like a weight behind my words. But this wasn't for her. And it wasn't for the people in the pews who were starting to realize they didn't know the full story of the man they were mourning. This was for me. I know many of you saw him as a pillar, I said calmly, and in some ways he was. People are complicated. They can be generous and deceitful, loving and careless, strong in public and destructive in private. A few faces stiffened. A few people looked down at their laps. I recognized the discomfort. I had lived inside it for years. I became very good at protecting an image, very good at smiling in public and breaking in private. I didn't look at the woman again. I didn't need to. I could feel her presence like a weight behind my words. But this wasn't for her. And it wasn't for the people in the pews who were starting to realize they didn't know the full story of the man they were mourning. This was for me. I know many of you saw him as a pillar, I said calmly, and in some ways he was. People are complicated. They can be generous and deceitful, loving and careless, strong in public and destructive in private. A few faces stiffened. A few people looked down at their laps. I recognized the discomfort. I had lived inside it for years. I wasn't asking you to change how you remember him, I added. I'm simply refusing to erase myself anymore. That was when I heard it. A sharp intake of breath, someone whispering my name, a chair scraping softly against the floor. My sister-in-law sat frozen in the front row, her face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't known, or maybe she had known just enough to pretend ignorance was safety. Either way, this wasn't the version of the funeral she'd rehearsed in her head. I carried the truth alone for a long time, I said, my voice quieter now, heavier. I thought that was the price of love. I thought if I stayed silent, I could keep the peace. I shook my head slowly. But silence didn't protect me. It only taught me how to disappear. The words surprised me with their certainty. They felt finished, final. I realized then that something irreversible was happening, not in the room, but inside me. A door I had kept locked for years had swung open, and I could feel fresh air rushing in. I forgive him, I said after a pause that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, not because what he did didn't matter, but because I deserved to live without carrying it anymore. That was the moment the room truly shifted. Forgiveness made people uneasy. It meant this wasn't a performance. It wasn't bitterness dressed up as bravery. It was something deeper and harder to dismiss. I hope, I finished, that we all remember this. Love without honesty is not devotion, and protecting the truth at the expense of your own sanity is not strength. I stepped back from the podium. For a split second, no one moved. The pastor looked uncertain. The funeral director avoided my eyes. Somewhere in the back, someone was crying, but it wasn't the clean, ceremonial grief the room had been filled with earlier. This was something else. As I returned to my seat, my knees finally began to shake. My hands felt cold. I stared straight ahead, breathing carefully, aware that whatever happened next, whatever people said or didn't say, there was no going back. I had told the truth out loud, and I didn't yet know who would thank me for it, or who would never forgive me at all. After the service ended, no one knew where to stand. People clustered in small groups, whispering in voices meant to sound respectful but carried sharp edges. Some avoided my eyes completely, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the flower arrangements. Others stared too long, like they were trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the one who had just spoken. I stayed seated for a moment longer than necessary. My body felt hollow, like everything essential had already been poured out at the podium. The shaking in my legs returned, subtle but insistent. I pressed my feet flat against the floor, grounding myself, reminding myself that I was still here, still whole. When I finally stood, the aisle felt longer than before. Halfway down, someone touched my arm. It was an older woman from the church, her grip gentle but deliberate. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes glossy. "I wish someone had done that for me." Before I could respond, she let go and melted back into the crowd. That one sentence landed harder than all the stairs combined. Outside, the winter air hit my face and I inhaled deeply, grateful for something that felt clean and sharp. I stood near the steps, watching people file past. Some offered quick hugs, some murmured polite condolences that now felt strangely out of place. A few nodded at me with a respect that hadn't been there before. Then his brother approached. He stopped a few feet away, hands shoved into his coat pockets, jaw tight. "That wasn't appropriate," he said quietly. Not angry, controlled, dangerous in its calm. I met his eyes without flinching. It was honest. "This wasn't the time," he replied. "Today was about honoring him." I honored the truth for the first time. His nostrils flared. "You embarrass the family." The word family used to make me fold in on myself, used to make me soften, apologize, explain. Not today. "I protected the family for years," I said evenly. "I just stopped protecting the lie." For a moment, I thought he might argue. Instead, he stepped back, eyes scanning the people nearby, calculating what version of the story he could still control. "People are talking," he said. "I know," I replied. He shook his head as if disappointed. "You could have kept this private." I almost laughed. Private had been my prison. He walked away without another word, already pulling his phone out, already managing damage. I watched him go and realized something unsettling and freeing all at once. I no longer cared what story they told about me next. Later, as the crowd thinned, I spotted her again, the woman from the pew. She stood alone near the parking lot, arms wrapped around herself. For a moment, our eyes met. She looked away first. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel rage. I felt closure. Driving home, the quiet inside the car felt different from the quiet in the church. This one wasn't heavy. It wasn't performative. It was real. My phone buzzed once, then again, messages stacking up. I didn't check them. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tired, I looked older, but I also looked lighter. When I pulled into the driveway, the house greeted me with familiar stillness. I stepped inside, kicked off my shoes, and leaned against the door, finally letting out a breath I'd been holding for years. The truth had cost me something. I could already feel it. But as my phone buzzed again, this time with a name I didn't expect to see, I understood something else. The real fallout hadn't started yet, and not everyone would stay silent the way the church had. Some people were about to demand answers, and I would have to decide very carefully how much more of myself I was willing to give. The phone kept buzzing on the kitchen counter while I stood at the sink, staring at nothing. I hadn't even taken off my coat yet. My purse sat where I dropped it, the folded speech still inside, untouched, and now completely irrelevant. The house smelled faintly of lilies, sympathy flowers delivered earlier that morning, arranged by well-meaning hands. At the funeral, people had praised my composure. They had no idea how close I was to splintering. I finally picked up the phone. Voicemails, texts, missed calls. Some names I expected, some I didn't. You didn't have to do all that. I hope you know what you started. Thank you for saying what so many of us felt. Please call me when you can. I sat at the table and let the chair scrape loudly against the floor. The noise grounded me. This was my house, my life. And yet, the moment I stopped protecting his image, it felt like everyone believed they were entitled to an explanation. The first call I answered was from my mother. She didn't say hello. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice careful, like she was afraid the wrong word might shatter me. "I think so," I said honestly. There was a pause. "You were very brave today." I closed my eyes. Brave wasn't the word people used when I stayed silent. Brave only appeared once I disrupted something. "I didn't plan it," I admitted. "It just came out." "I know," she said softly. "Sometimes the truth gets tired of waiting." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, hands wrapped around a mug I hadn't realized I'd poured. My body felt heavy, but my mind was strangely alert, like it was bracing for impact. It didn't take long. A knock at the door, sharp, impatient. I didn't have to look through the peephole to know who it was. His sister stood on the porch, arms crossed, grief sharpened into something harder. Her eyes flicked past me as soon as I opened the door, scanning the house like she still had some claim to it. "We need to talk," she said. "Now isn't a good time," I replied. She scoffed. "You made it everyone's business today. Don't pretend you get to hide now." That old instinct, the one that told me to smooth things over, to apologize for discomfort, rose up automatically. And then it stopped. "I didn't hide," I said calmly. "I spoke." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You humiliated him. He's gone, and I spent years humiliating myself to protect him." Her mouth opened, then closed. She hadn't expected that answer. "You could have destroyed everything. His reputation, our family." I met her gaze without blinking. I didn't destroy anything that wasn't already cracked. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension sat thick between us, loaded with all the things we'd never said before, about late nights, unexplained absences, and the way she'd looked at me once years ago, like she knew something I didn't. Or maybe I had known, I just hadn't allowed myself to name it. She exhaled sharply. "People are asking questions." I nodded. "They should." Her eyes narrowed. "What exactly did you mean by double life?" There it was. The demand. The fear. The realization that my words had consequences she couldn't control. I felt a strange calm settle over me. I meant what I said, no more, no less. Her jaw tightened. "This isn't over." I watched her turn and walk away, heels clicking against the porch like punctuation. When the door closed, I leaned my forehead against it, heart racing, not with fear, but with certainty. This wasn't over. The truth had left the sanctuary, followed me home, and now it was knocking on doors I had kept closed for years. And the next time it came out, it wouldn't be in a room full of mourners. It would be in private, with people who had far more to lose than I did. That night, sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the sanctuary again, the way people's faces changed as my words landed. The moment reverence cracked into confusion. I replayed my sister-in-law's voice at the door, sharp with warning. This isn't over. She was right. By morning, the fallout had a rhythm. Messages stopped pretending to be gentle. You blindsided everyone. He can't defend himself. You owe the family an explanation. I stared at my phone from across the bed like it was something alive. For years, I had lived inside other people's expectations. What a good wife should endure, what loyalty required, how much silence counted as love. I had stepped out of that role for 10 minutes at a podium, and now everyone wanted me back in line. I didn't respond. Instead, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table as sunlight crept across the floor. The quiet felt earned now, fragile, but mine. Around noon, my phone rang again, a number I knew too well. His best friend. We'd been close once, double dates, late-night talks, shared holidays. After I discovered the truth, I had wondered how much he knew, how much he'd helped cover. We'd never spoken about it directly. Until now. I didn't know, he said after I answered, skipping any greeting. His voice sounded shaken. I swear to you, I didn't. I didn't say you did, I replied. But people are asking me, he continued. They want details. They're saying you painted him as a liar. I looked out the window at the bare branches of the tree in the yard. I painted him as human. There was a long pause. You know this changes how people remember him. Yes, I said softly, and it changes how they remember me. He exhaled. Are you going to explain yourself? Clear things up? The question hit harder than I expected. Clear things up, as if the truth was a mess I'd made instead of a weight I'd been carrying. I already explained myself. I'm not doing it again. After we hung up, I felt something close to grief, but not for him, for the version of myself that would have over-explained, over-apologized, bent herself into something palatable. That woman was gone. By evening, the rumors had evolved, not just about him, but about me. That I was bitter, that I exaggerated, that I waited until he was dead to speak because I was afraid to face him. I laughed once out loud, the sound sharp in the empty house. Afraid. They had no idea how much courage it took to survive quietly, how much strength it took to stay, how much more it took to finally stop. I poured myself a glass of water and stood in the living room, the walls lined with photos from a life that now felt distant. I realized something unsettling and clarifying all at once. The truth had given me freedom, but it had also made me a threat, because people who benefit from silence don't forgive the person who breaks it. And as my phone lit up again, this time with a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years, I understood that the hardest part wasn't saying the truth out loud. It was standing firm once everyone decided they preferred the lie. And that test was just beginning. The message came just after sunrise. I think you should know what people are saying. It was from a woman I barely knew, someone connected to his work, someone who had smiled at me more than once at company dinners, someone who had once told me I was lucky. I stared at the text for a long moment before replying. What are they saying? I typed. Her response came quickly. That you were unstable, that you imagined things, that grief finally pushed you over the edge. I felt my chest tighten, not with panic, but with a familiar ache. Gaslighting doesn't always come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes it spreads, passed from mouth to mouth, reshaped to protect the comfort of those who don't want to look too closely. I set the phone down and pressed my palms flat against the table. This was the part no one warned you about. Telling the truth didn't just change how others saw him, it changed how they treated me. Suddenly, I wasn't the grieving widow anymore. I was a disruption, an inconvenience, a woman who refused to play her role correctly. By mid-morning, I had 3 emails asking if I would consider clarifying my remarks. One even suggested a public statement, as if honesty required editing once it made people uncomfortable. I deleted them all. Instead, I did something radical. I left the house. I drove with no destination in mind, windows cracked open, cold air burning my cheeks awake. For years, my life had been carefully contained, monitored by lies I didn't choose, silence I maintained for survival. Today, I needed movement, proof that I could go anywhere without explaining myself. I pulled into a small park by the river and sat on a bench, hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. The water moved steadily, indifferent to human drama. It didn't pause to justify itself. It didn't circle back to soothe feelings. It just flowed. A woman sat down at the other end of the bench. We didn't speak at first. Then she glanced at me and said quietly, "You were very brave yesterday." I looked at her surprised. I was there, in the back. Something in her voice made me listen. My mother stayed silent her whole life. It killed her slowly. What you did, it mattered. Tears blurred my vision before I could stop them. I nodded, unable to speak. When she stood to leave, she squeezed my arm gently and said, "They'll try to punish you for it, but don't let them make you small again." I sat there long after she was gone. By the time I returned home, my phone had stopped buzzing, not because people had stopped talking, but because they were waiting, watching, deciding what version of me they could live with. I stood in my doorway and understood something with sudden clarity. This wasn't just about my husband anymore. It was about who I would allow myself to be now that the truth was no longer a secret. I could retreat, I could soften, I could apologize for making people uncomfortable, or I could keep walking forward, quietly, steadily, without explanation. That choice settled deep in my bones. And just as I locked the door behind me, my phone lit up again. This time with a message that made my breath catch. "I need to talk to you. I know more than you think." The truth, it seemed, wasn't finished surfacing. Not yet. Not even close. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. "I know more than you think." The words felt heavier than anything anyone had said to me since the funeral. Not accusatory, not defensive, almost careful. I read the name again. It was his cousin, someone who'd always hovered at the edges of our lives, close enough to know things, far enough to avoid responsibility. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I sat down on the couch and let the quiet settle around me. My body knew what was coming before my mind caught up. That familiar tightening, the instinct to brace. Truth has a way of reopening doors you didn't realize were still unlocked. When I finally replied, I kept it simple. "What do you know?" The dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then, more than you were ever told, and more than he wanted you to know. We agreed to meet the next afternoon at a small cafe across town, neutral ground. I arrived early, chose a table near the window, ordered tea I didn't drink. My hands stayed wrapped around the cup, warming themselves more than anything else. When she walked in, she looked different, smaller, like someone who had been carrying something too long and was tired of pretending it wasn't heavy. She didn't waste time. "I was there the night you first started asking questions," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the table. "Years ago, I heard the arguments. I knew about the other woman before you did." My stomach dropped, but my face stayed still. "And you said nothing," I replied. She nodded. "I told myself it wasn't my place, that you were strong, that you'd figure it out." I let out a slow breath. That lie, the one people tell themselves to justify silence, felt familiar. "There was more," she continued. "It wasn't just one affair. It was a pattern. Trips, accounts, people covering for him. I didn't know how deep it went until after he got sick." I felt a dull ache behind my eyes, not sharp enough to cry, just heavy. "And now?" I asked. She looked up at me then, finally. "Now, I can't pretend anymore. What you said at the funeral, it broke something open." I nodded. That made sense. Truth does that. It doesn't just expose, it invites others to stop hiding too. "I don't need details," I said after a moment. "I already know enough." She flinched slightly. "I can back you up," she said quickly, "if anyone says you lied, if they try to rewrite it." There it was, the offer, the alliance, the sudden willingness to speak now that the ground had shifted. I studied her face, searching for sincerity. I believed she meant it, but belief wasn't the same as necessity. "I'm not building a case," I said gently. "I'm building a life." She swallowed, nodding. "I understand." We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that no longer felt awkward. When she stood to leave, she hesitated. She said, "I'm sorry for not saying anything sooner." "I know," I replied, and I did. People speak when it's safe, rarely when it's right. Driving home, I felt something settle inside me, not relief, not anger, but clarity. I didn't need witnesses. I didn't need validation. I didn't need to convince anyone of my truth. I had already lived it. That night, I slept deeply for the first time since the funeral. No dreams, no rehearsed conversations, just rest. But when morning came, it brought something new. An envelope slipped through my mail slot. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a name I hadn't expected to see. Someone else, it seemed, was finally ready to speak, and whatever they were about to reveal would change everything I thought I knew about how long the truth had been circling me, waiting for the right moment to land. I stood at the kitchen counter holding the envelope like it might burn me. No return address, no handwriting I recognized, just my name written carefully, deliberately, like whoever sent it wanted to be understood, not discovered. I sat down before opening it. Experience had taught me this much. When truth arrives quietly, it's usually heavy. Inside was a single page folded once. No greeting, no apology, just words. "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm writing because you deserve to know you weren't wrong." My chest tightened. The letter was from one of his former colleagues, a man I'd met twice, maybe 3 times, always polite, always distant, someone I'd never suspected would step into this. "He wasn't careful," the letter continued. "He was confident. He believed his image would protect him forever, and for a long time it did." I closed my eyes briefly, letting that settle. The letter outlined fragments, not gossip, not drama, patterns, meetings that weren't work-related, expenses quietly approved, people who looked the other way because it was easier than asking questions. "I saw how it affected you," the writer admitted. "Not directly, but I noticed the way you stopped attending events, the way you smiled less, the way he spoke for you." My fingers curled around the paper. Someone had seen me. "I didn't say anything then," the letter said. "I told myself it wasn't my place, that you were handling it, that silence was neutrality." The lie again. "But when you spoke at the funeral," it continued, I realized neutrality had made me complicit. I read the final lines twice. I don't want anything from you. I just wanted you to know you weren't imagining it, and you weren't alone, even when it felt that way. I folded the letter slowly and placed it on the table. The house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. Memories surface differently now, not as questions, but as confirmations. The nights I'd stayed awake, doubting my instincts, the times I'd almost spoken, then swallowed my words. I had been right. That truth didn't feel triumphant. It felt sobering. By afternoon, I'd received 2 more messages, one from a woman I'd never met saying she'd been on the other side of his charm once and walked away ashamed. Another from a former neighbor who said, "I always wondered how you stayed so calm." I didn't respond to either, because something was shifting. This wasn't about collecting confessions or building a narrative that satisfied public curiosity. It was about recognizing a pattern I had survived and choosing what to do with the knowledge now that it no longer lived in shadows. Still, I couldn't ignore the undercurrent. The people who were reaching out weren't reaching out randomly. They were doing it because the story was changing. And when stories change, power shifts. That evening, as I stood at the sink washing a single mug, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't a message. It was a call. From her sister. I let it ring. Then it stopped. Seconds later, a voicemail notification appeared. I didn't listen right away, because I already knew what it would be. Damage control, fear, an attempt to reshape the truth now that it was no longer contained. I dried my hand slowly, deliberately. The truth had been spoken. Others were confirming it, and now the people who benefited from my silence were running out of places to hide. I pressed play on the voicemail, and as her voice filled the kitchen, tight, controlled, edged with urgency, I realized the next confrontation wasn't about what happened in the past. It would be about what I was willing to allow into my future. And that was a line I was no longer afraid to draw. I listened to the voicemail once, then again, not because I needed clarity, but because I needed to hear the fear underneath the words. "You've said enough," my sister-in-law's voice insisted, tight and measured. "People are getting the wrong idea. This has gone too far. We need to meet and clear this up before it damages everyone involved." Clear this up. That phrase followed me all evening. It didn't mean truth. It meant containment. I deleted the voicemail without responding. An hour later, my phone rang again. This time, it was his mother. I hesitated before answering. Grief had carved deep lines into her face at the funeral. I had almost reached for her then, almost apologized for the discomfort my honesty caused. Old habits die hard. "Why would you do this now?" she asked, skipping pleasantries. "He's gone. What good does this do?" I leaned against the counter, feeling the cool surface ground me. "It does good for me." There was a long silence on the other end. When she spoke again, her voice cracked not with sadness, but with frustration. "You're rewriting him." "No," I said gently. "I'm telling the part I lived." "You didn't have to say it publicly," she snapped. "You made us all look foolish." I closed my eyes. For years, I had confused their comfort with my responsibility. I didn't make anyone look foolish. I stopped pretending. Her breath hitched. "People are questioning everything now. His work, his reputation, his character." "That was already in question," I said quietly. "I just stopped carrying it alone." She hung up without saying goodbye. That night, I poured myself a glass of water and stood in the living room, the house dark except for one lamp. Shadows stretched across the walls like old memories trying to reclaim space. I realized something unsettling and freeing. They weren't angry because I lied. They were angry because I didn't. The next day, the social fallout took shape. A church friend canceled lunch plans for now. A distant relative unfriended me. A coworker sent a message that said, "I hope you find peace," which felt more like a warning than a wish. But then, unexpectedly, something else happened. A woman I barely knew dropped off a handwritten note at my door. "I heard you speak," it read. "I left my marriage 3 years ago for similar reasons. I didn't think anyone would ever say it out loud. Thank you." I held that note longer than any text, any voicemail, any accusation, because it reminded me why I spoke. Not to shame, not to punish, not to control the narrative, but to stop lying for someone who had never told the whole truth for me. That afternoon, my therapist asked me a question that lingered long after the session ended. What would it look like to protect your peace as fiercely as you once protected his image? The answer came slowly. It looked like boundaries. It looked like silence where explanations were demanded. It looked like choosing who had access to me now and who didn't. That evening, I blocked several numbers without guilt. As I set my phone down, I felt something settle. Not relief exactly, but resolute, because the truth had done its job. It had spoken, it had echoed, it had reached the people who needed it. And now the final work wasn't about convincing anyone of what I endured. It was about deciding what kind of life I would build in the aftermath, and whether I would finally allow myself to live without carrying anyone else's secrets ever again. The days that followed felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, quiet in the way a storm leaves the air heavy, charged, uncertain. The kind of quiet where you're aware of everything. The ticking clock, the refrigerator humming, the way your own breath sounds louder when there's no one left demanding pieces of you. I stopped checking my phone first thing in the morning. That alone felt like rebellion. Instead, I made small routines: coffee by the window, a short walk around the block, writing in a notebook I'd once kept hidden in the back of a drawer, the one where I used to pour thoughts I didn't feel safe saying out loud. Now, there was nothing to hide it from. Still, the consequences kept arriving, just more subtly now. An invitation that never came, a conversation that ended abruptly. People who once praised my strength now describing me as complicated. I let them. For years, I had bent myself into something easy to explain, palatable, admirable in a way that never challenged anyone else's comfort. I had mistaken that for peace. This was different. One afternoon, I ran into a woman from the church at the pharmacy. She smiled tightly, eyes scanning my face like she expected cracks. "I hope you're doing okay," she said. "I am," I replied. She hesitated. "Some people think, well, they think you shared too much." I met her gaze calmly. "I think I shared just enough to stop lying." Her smile faded. She nodded once and walked away. I stood there afterward, surprised by how steady I felt. No racing heart, no need to justify myself, just a quiet certainty that I no longer owed access to anyone who required my silence as the price of belonging. That night, I sat in the living room surrounded by years of carefully curated memories, photos, cards, mementos from a marriage that had been both real and false at the same time. I didn't throw anything away. I didn't burn letters or stage a symbolic cleansing. I simply moved some things into a box and placed it in the closet. Not to erase the past, but to put it in its proper place. Later, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, yes, but there was something new there too. Space. Like my face finally had room to breathe. I thought about the woman I had been at the funeral podium. How terrified she'd felt. How free she sounded anyway. That woman hadn't been reckless. She'd been done. And as I turned off the light and lay down, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't afraid of what people thought anymore. I was afraid of going back to the version of myself who would have apologized for telling the truth. And that fear, finally, was something I was no longer willing to live with. Because the truth had given me something I hadn't had in years. Not approval, not peace from others, but ownership of my own voice. And I wasn't about to give it up now, especially when I could feel the final reckoning approaching. The part where I would decide what healing really meant and who I would become once the echoes finally faded. Healing didn't arrive the way I thought it would. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense, no single morning where I woke up feeling whole. Instead, it crept in quietly, disguised as ordinary choices. The decision not to answer a call, the relief of saying no without explanation, the strange peace that came from letting certain relationships dissolve without a fight. I started noticing how my body responded to things, how my shoulders no longer tensed when my phone buzzed, how my stomach didn't drop every time someone mentioned his name, how silence, once terrifying, now felt like rest. One afternoon, I sat across from my therapist and admitted something I hadn't said out loud yet. "I don't miss the marriage," I said. "I miss who I thought I was in it." She nodded. "And who were you?" I thought for a long moment. Someone who believed endurance was the same as love. That realization hit harder than any accusation ever could. I had been praised for staying, for forgiving, for being understanding. No one ever asked what it cost me. In the weeks after the funeral, people continued to sort themselves out around me. Some faded quietly, unwilling to reconcile the truth with the version of me they preferred. Others surprised me, showing up with kindness that didn't require silence in return. Those were the people I kept. One evening, I received a message from a woman who had been sitting 2 rows behind me at the funeral. She wrote, "I went home and told my daughter the truth about my marriage for the first time. I don't know what happens next, but I know it mattered that you spoke." I sat with that message for a long time. That was when I understood something important. My truth wasn't just mine anymore, not because it belonged to the public, but because honesty creates permission. Permission for others to name what they've been surviving quietly. Permission to imagine something different. That didn't mean it was my job to carry anyone else. It meant my voice had weight now, and I got to choose how to use it. I started thinking about the future, not in terms of recovery, but intention. What kind of life I wanted when it wasn't built around reacting to someone else's choices. What kind of woman I wanted to be when I wasn't protecting a story that wasn't true. For the first time, the question didn't scare me. It felt open. That night, I stood on the porch and looked out at the dark street, breathing in the cool air. I thought about the woman who'd stepped up to the microphone weeks earlier, hand shaking, heart exposed. She hadn't known what would happen next, but she trusted herself anyway. And now, standing here, I realized something with quiet certainty. The hardest part was over. Not because the pain was gone, but because I had stopped abandoning myself to keep other people comfortable. The final step wasn't about forgiveness or closure or even understanding. It was about choosing myself, consistently, without apology. And tomorrow I would take that choice one step further, in a way I hadn't planned, in a way that would finally make the truth feel complete. The last step didn't feel dramatic. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no final conversation that wrapped everything up neatly. It happened on an ordinary morning when I woke up and realized I wasn't carrying anyone else's version of events anymore. Not his, not his family's, not the community's, just mine. I made breakfast slowly, letting the quiet exist without filling it. I noticed how my body felt, lighter, steadier, no longer braced for the next demand or accusation. The truth had settled into me, not as a weapon, but as a boundary. I understood then that speaking at the funeral hadn't been about him at all. It had been about ending my own silence. For years, I had edited myself to preserve peace that never truly existed. I had learned how to smile while unraveling, how to make myself smaller so a lie could stand taller. That day, at the podium, I stopped doing that, and nothing terrible happened. Some people left, some people judged, some people thanked me quietly and never spoke of it again, but I stayed. I kept my voice, I kept my integrity, I kept myself. I didn't need everyone to understand. I didn't need validation from people who only loved me when I was convenient. I had finally learned that my healing didn't require consensus. It required honesty. I forgave myself for the years I stayed silent. I forgave myself for confusing endurance with love. And I forgave myself for surviving the best way I knew how at the time. That forgiveness changed everything. Now, when I think of my husband, I don't erase the good or exaggerate the harm. I hold both truths without letting either define me. I am no longer responsible for managing anyone else's memory or reputation. I am responsible only for how I live next. And I choose to live free. Free from secrecy, free from shame, free from the version of myself that thought silence was safety. If you learned something new from my life story, please like this video, subscribe to join our community for more stories like mine, and comment down below where you're watching this video from. I'd truly love to know.